Hello and welcome to another episode of Meanbrews. Today I'm covering English Porter or Brown Porter. Let's get right into the data. I was able to find 48 English Porter recipes. 2 were best of show, 19 gold and 14 silver, 9 bronze, and 4 were award-winning recipes. A pretty large suite of dates here, all the way back to 1987. Popular style. A lot more recipes today that are winning, but this is the histogram showing the dates here. BJCP style is 13C, a moderate strength dark brown English ale with a restrained roasty or roasty bitter character. All right, so let's see. We're not seeing hardly any evolution at all. I think there's only 2 or 3 variables that seem to be trending. But there is quite a bit of interpretation of the style and ingredients used. Pretty large swath of different ingredients used for this beer. The original gravity was anywhere between 1.043 and 1.063, with the mean being 1.052 on the very high range or high end of the BJCP range. My recipe will sit right there at the average. There was no evolution. FG anywhere between 1.010 to 1.022, pretty dry. Average 1.014, and that's where my recipe lies with the yeast that I chose. IBUs anywhere between 18 and 38. The average was 28, and I will be right on that average of 28 as well. SRM we had anywhere from 20, which is in the bottom of the BJCP range, up to 53. The average here was 28 over 55 EBC. My recipe will be a little high on that, just where it landed with the malts that I chose. Looking at the percentages, the average was about 77% base malt, 9.1% crystal, 12.1% roast, 1.3% adjuncts if used, and 0.5% toasted malts. Looking at the distribution of those, just focusing in on the base malts here. Base malts were used anywhere between 55 and 90% of the grist. The average was right around 77, and I'm going to be at about 78, 79% for my recipe. I want to zoom in here on the specialty malts. Next most prominent is roast. 100% of the recipes use a roast malt. It's porter. Average of about 12%, but a huge range from 1 to 36% of the grist. Crystal from 1 to 26, 28% of the grist, with an average of about 9. And toasted malts, actually adjuncts next, only used in about less than 1 in 5 recipes used adjuncts, and even fewer than that used toasted malts. My recipe is going to focus on these 2, and I'll be right in the means for both of them. Looking at the base malts that were used, there were 4 different base malts used, and wheat, Munich, and amber were used in such small amounts that I'm neglecting them for this recipe. The main was a Maris Otter or Golden Promise or a British style pale malt. I grouped them all together from anywhere for around 51, 52% of the grist up to 90%. My recipe is going to be again at that 78% of the grist average. Looking at the crystal malts, we had 6 different crystal malts used. I'll speak to the first 2. Medium crystal was the most prominent. Again, a huge range between 2 and 19% of the grist. The average right around 8. I'm going to be at 5 in my recipe because I'm using dark crystal as well, which had a huge range as well, from 1 to 16%. Average again this one's about 6 or 7%. And I'm going to be at 4, and that makes up my 9%, which is the average crystal malts for all the recipes. Toasted malts, there were 4 different toasted malts used here in 1 or 2 recipes. Not very prominent at all. Roast malts, well, we had, this is the star of the show here. So most prominent was dark chocolate. At 70% of the recipes used a dark chocolate at an average of about 5% of the grist. Then we had brown malt. Brown is essential for this style. If you read Jamil's book, he talks about how brown malt is critical for a porter. We had 55% of the recipes used brown malt at an average of about 10% of the grist. And then the next most is the pale chocolate. I split the pale from the dark. There were a lot of recipes that used one or the other, and some that used both. So about a third of the recipes used a pale chocolate at right around 4% of the grist, and then we also had black malt, midnight wheat, chocolate rye, and roasted barley. The most prominent adjunct used was flaked oats and other flaked malts. Also, there was a recipe that used cocoa nibs and macadamia nuts, and one as a base style porter, not as a spiced or herb or vegetable beer. So pretty interesting. That was on the AHA website. We have 20 different bittering hops used. Most prominent EKG, Fuggles, Challenger, Willamette, English style hops, Northern Brewer, Magnum, Pearl, and Howler. And then we had 12 others that were used in a single recipe that I'm just grouping them together. I'll be sticking with EKG to bitter. Flavor hops, we had 9 different flavor hops, Fuggles, Willamette, EKG, and Challenger, and then 5 others used in a single recipe. I'm going to use Fuggles. Willamette is very close to Fuggles, so I think that's the flavor style that you want to stick with this beer. Very, very good data supporting that. Aroma hops, we had 13 different aroma hops used. EKG, Fuggle, Willamette, Cascade, First Gold, and Howler were used in more than one recipe each. 27% for EKG. We had 7 other aroma hops used in a single recipe. And I'm going to use EKG for aroma. Looking at the hop rates, both of them pretty much on top of one another. The low end being at 0.05 ounces per gallon up to around 0.3 ounces per gallon. That's 1.5 ounces in a 5-gallon batch. Is that right? Yeah. The mean for both is 0.15, and that's where I'm going to be for both my flavor and aroma additions. I will note that, excuse me, we are seeing a less likely usage of aroma hops over time. Not to the point where I wouldn't use them, but it is trending down and perhaps fading away as a addition that you should have for this style of beer. Not surprisingly, single infusion was the most dominant type of mash schedule. There were, I think, 1 step mash, so I recommend a single infusion. Here are the mash rests. We had a protein rest or a acid rest and a protein rest. Don't recommend just one recipe did that. The range of mash temperatures for the single infusion were anywhere between 147 to 160. The average was 153. And that average isn't moving over time, so I will stick with 153 for my recipe. Boil duration anywhere between 60 and 105 minutes. Average was 67, and I will stick with a 60-minute boil for my recipe. We had 18 different yeasts used. It's really interesting that Worthington White Shield was the most winningest yeast used, followed by Whitbread, Fuller's, Boddington's, a bunch of British strains here. We had 7 single-use yeasts up here. All British except Chico and except the alt strain. I'm going to stick with the White Labs WLP013 or Y Yeast 1028 as the yeast to use here. I think it's Omega. I'll get to it at the end. I'll show you the Omega strain that's equivalent. Water chemistry, 84 calcium, but a big range, 11 magnesium, 38 sodium, it's pretty big, 76 sulfates, and 80 chlorides. I will be low on the calcium and then high on the sodium, and then the others are right on their numbers. And the reason why I'm high on sodium is that is actually trending up. So Sodium ions is trending to about the 60 parts per million level here. Fermentation temps anywhere between 55 and 70. Sweet spots around 66, 65 for both for the 013 and Fuller strain. I believe this is Prips, the W007. It had a lower temperature around 62, 63, but not a lot of data here. I will be on the high end of the scale here at 68 because we are seeing that increase over time to about 68 degrees across all strains. So a little bit more fruity esters produced here when you ferment warmer. Other variables that we studied, carbonation volumes, the average was 2.25. This was strange. There were some in the 1s and there were some in the 3s. I don't know what was going on. I think this should be lower than this. I think you should try to hit about 2 to 2.2 for this style. Mash pH was pretty low. 5.35 was the average. Now on to the Meanbrews recipe. I'm using faucet malts here because they give me the right color, and you want to use a British malt for this style. Maris Otter or Golden Promise at 78.5%, brown malt, which is essential for the style, at 6.5%, Crystal 60 at 5.2%, and then you're going to use a dark crystal. This is 80, 90. There's some good dark crystals out there. 4% of the grist. Chocolate malt 3.1. This is a dark chocolate, traditional dark chocolate. And then a pale chocolate malt at 2.7% of the grist. I'm going to bitter with EKG at about 18 IBUs. I'm going to put in 0.15 ounce per gallon both of Fuggle at 15 and EKG at 5. And then I'm using the Worthington White Shield strain, which is White Lab 013, Yeast 1028, or the Omega London Ale. Shooting for 1.052 and 28 IBUs, and there's the water chemistry. I don't need to repeat that for you. Mash pH 5.35. I'm going to do an infusion at 153 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius. I'm going to mash out and boil it for sparge as usual and boil for an hour. Chill to 66, oxygenate, and I'm going to use a 2-liter starter for a 5-gallon batch. You could probably get away with a 1-liter starter here, as long as you have a healthy yeast to start with. I'm going to ferment it at 68, as we discussed, or 20°C, for 7 days, and raise it up to 70 Fahrenheit or 21 Celsius for 7 more days. Bottle or keg and serve it at 2.3 volumes. Okay, that's it for this week. Next style is going to be voted on by my Patreon. I'm going to let them pick the style again. So you'll find out what it is when I present the next video. So see you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.